think tanks and partnerships for change. This year's annual review and annual conference, we've decided to address the issue of partnerships for change. Last year, Anne-Marie Slaughter at the On Think Tanks conference talked about the concept of a change hub. She reflected that to bring about change, think tanks had to work with others, had to create a space that would be welcoming of other actors in the policy space, and not just policymakers and the private sector and the media, but also NGOs, grassroots, social movements, why not even lobbies. Think tanks, in our experience, are good at working with maybe one or two of these actors, but not with everybody else. And it depends very much on their own personal stories. So we've convened a number of think tank experts working across the world who have a particular affinity or experience working with different actors. We think that part of the answer is in how they govern themselves, who sits on their boards, what roles do they have? Are their boards made up of just academics, some policymakers? Do they also involve NGO activists, social movement activists, community leaders, indigenous leaders in some cases, members of the media, from political parties? We also think it has to do with how they develop their own strategies, how they conceive their roles and their function in their society. So are they thinking about influencing policy directly, going directly to politicians, to policymakers, to anybody who is in power right now? Or do they think that it's much better, or it's much more effective in the long run to help build coalitions or participate in coalitions? This is going to affect, of course, how they engage with others, and the question we have is, do they have the capacity to engage with others in this way? It also has to do with how they communicate their research and how they develop their own research agendas, of course, and how do they choose what's important and what needs to be studied, and then how do they choose how they communicate and who they communicate with. These things might have to change if think tanks want to engage with other actors in the policy space. But also very important, we believe, has to do with who they hire and how they hire, who are the people that work in the organization. I think it's safe to say that by and large, think tanks around the world are perceived as middle class, upper middle class organizations. The barriers of entry are fairly high for the general public. Think tanks tend to recruit from top universities. They tend to recruit from backgrounds that push aside researchers, communicators, and managers, think tanks from disadvantaged backgrounds. And so in some way they might end up being quite homogeneous organizations, not very representative of the rest of society. So engaging with people from other parts of their country, from other parts of the cities where they're based, who might be working in other types of organizations might be hard. Now, some think tanks are better than others at engaging with certain actors, right? So some think tanks are better than others at engaging with the private sector. Some think tanks are better at engaging with political parties, with NGOs, with activists, with social movements. Listening to experts, sort of discussing this with think tanks over the years, I think it has to do with a number of factors, but let me identify at least three. First one has to do with their story of origin. Where do they come from? Some think tanks come from government. They were developed, set up, designed by governments, and they function within or at arm's length from government. Those will naturally have an affinity and will find it very easy to engage with government. Other think tanks come from academia. They were set up within universities or by academics who left university and set up their own organizations. And of course, they will find it a lot easier to engage with universities and with other academics around the world. Others have been set up by NGOs, or NGOs, campaigning NGOs have become think tanks. And so they'll find it a lot easier to work with activists and social movements, maybe even with grassroots organizations. Then you have think tanks that have, close affinity with the media. Some of their directors are former editors or journalists. And then think tanks that are clearly linked to political parties, whether it's in a formal way, like some political party think tanks, or an informal way where political party operators have set up a think tank. So it's inevitable that these different think tanks, based on their origin story, based on who was there at the beginning, will be better than others at engaging with different actors. And we believe there are very good lessons to learn from those organizations. It doesn't mean that every think tank needs to be good at working with everybody. This would be very hard. But there are lessons to be learned, at least to establish working relationships or channels of communication. I think the second factor is one that think tanks probably have a lot less control over, and it has to do with the sector. Some sectors are dominated by certain types of organizations. So there might be, in the environmental sector, in the climate change sector, one might find that NGOs, activist NGOs, social movements are quite prominent in public debates. So think tanks working in those sectors, will have to engage with those organizations or those movements if they want to be relevant. In the economics, fiscal policy, macroeconomic, monetary policy world, maybe it's more about academic type discussions, more technocratic discussions, and so think tanks in those sectors will inevitably be engaging more with technocrats within Ministry of Finance, will be engaging more with academics in universities. So the sectors themselves will force think tanks to develop skills and competencies to work with those organizations or those types of other stakeholders in the field. And the third factor explaining why think tanks find it better or find it easier to work with others, I believe, is the people that work in the organization. Where do they come from? And so I think that if a think tank wants to shift its attention, say from technocrats in government to NGOs, to social movements, to the media, then one sure way of addressing that is to bring people from those actors, so those groups. So bring people from campaigning NGOs, from activist NGOs into the organization. They don't have to do the research that the more academic-minded researchers are doing, but they can certainly help develop the right agenda, the right research agendas. They can help in develop the right communication strategies, and they can help build bridges with organizations in those areas, those fields. Journalists can certainly help a think tank think a little bit more like a journalist or like a media organization, so that their work is much more relevant. Political party operators, politicians themselves, when they want a break from government or a break from politics, or even as they're active, bringing them in as senior fellows, bringing them in as board members is an excellent way for the think tank to learn a little bit more about this other actor that they want to work with to bring about change. What is our expectation of this process? We don't think that all think tanks should be working with everybody, but we certainly think that think tanks can play and should play a central role in bringing about change. And they can do this by following what Anne-Marie Slaughter was suggesting last year: become a hub, become a space that is welcoming of different types of organizations, of people from different backgrounds, of people and organizations that are using and promoting different types of evidence that bring with them different values, maybe different ideologies, but that if we are realistic about how change happens, we must accept they all have to be part of that conversation, and they all have to be part of that process of change.